Gary and I have been, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Gary and I have been colleagues for 4 decades. And friends and tennis partners, and we both have 2 daughters that grew up together. So we're kind of partners in crime. And I've watched Gary sort of evolve. That's always nice once we evolve, right? Into an extraordinary writer and storyteller, and just a very gifted narrative historian, as you'll see this morning. When any of us think about Gary, we think about him walking across campus with his arms out, holding a giant pile of newspaper clippings. In no particular order. And Gary, will you send me the book for a second? This is the book he's going to talk about, Dreams in the New Century. He started out writing this, as he does all of his books, with just a pile of clippings, a few quotations, and it eventually becomes a mountain of clippings. In fact, I'm sure you've all heard, of course, Joe DiMaggio, the Yankee Clipper. Well, Gary is the Florida Clipper. And he has a remarkable style, you'll see, as a storyteller. And it just comes naturally to him, but he's perfected it on the written page. And I don't know what he's going to say this morning because he's unpredictable. I'll just tell one story to convince you he's unpredictable. Years ago, we started the Florida Studies program together back in 2003. And I think I had been asked originally to talk to the Board of Trustees about the program, but somehow I was out of town, I couldn't make it, so Gary did it. And it was in a room sort of this size, but they had bright lights, and he was at a table, and what he didn't realize that day is that there was a group of visiting Vietnamese professors, sort of off in the corner, and so Gary's thinking about this whole scene as he's under these bright lights, and it reminded him of those old House Un-American Activities Committee, McCarthy hearings when suspected communists were sort of put under the bright lights. And so he sort of impulsively thought, well, I'll make a statement here. So before he talked to the Board of Trustees, he pounded on the desk and said, I want to say that I am not now, nor I've ever been, a member of the Communist Party. Howard Fast, the famous novelist, did that in front of the HUAC, House of American Activities Committee. Anyway, but Gary didn't realize that there were this group of communist professors. It was sort of enough English to realize that maybe they were being insulted, and it caused a minor international incident, for that morning. It was pretty funny. Gary's a unique person, and as you'll see, we play tennis every Sunday morning. That's our religious experience. Every Sunday morning we play doubles. He's my partner, and we have a saying when we play tennis that get out of his way, let Mormino be Mormino. Okay, and so that's what I'm going to do. If you're in for a treat. Okay, Gary.
A touching introduction. Thank you. Thank you. No international diplomatic incidents here. I set out to write this book about 15 years ago, I think. It's really taken me about a decade to write. And if you think about it, what an extraordinary decade, 2000 to 2010. And by the way, I realize that's 11 years, not 10 years. But let me read the opening of the book and remind you of what that time was like. Any oracle divining the events at Whiplash, Florida in the first decade of the 21st century would have been pummeled by citrus green infected oranges and foreclosure signs. Neither Carl Hyacin, Dave Barry, nor Tim Dorsey could have imagined a single decade featuring Y2K silliness, the Elian saga, the melodramatic 2000 election, the heart-stopping nation-altering events of 9/11, State leaders as interesting as Jeb Bush, Charlie Crist, Mel Martinez, Marco Rubio, and Rick Scott. A series of technological revolutions that hooked the young and confused the old. And a searing economic collapse known as the Great Recession. All in one decade. I mean, it's pretty amazing. I have about 10 talking points, 10 takeaways that I'd like to live. First of all, you may or may not recall that January 1st, 2000 was a very confident time in American history and in Florida history. A question that I think is going to be very interesting. Be honest now. How many of you are confident about the future of Florida? Raise your hand if you're confident about the future of Florida. You know, this is troubling. By the way, there are more votes here than I normally get. I've been to several such events and no one has raised their hand. What about confidence about America? Confidence about America today? Oh, about the same number. But in 2000, think about this. We were entering our third consecutive year of a balanced budget in the free spending Clinton era. Did anyone think your grandchildren would ever see a balanced budget again? I don't think so. The Cold War was over. We won the Cold War. There was not a moment of mutual self-destruction. And one of the big questions of the 2000 election, how are we going to spend the peace dividend? How will all this work out, by the way? There's a fascinating quote. In 1990s, they asked a veteran diplomat what he thought about the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union without a whiff of gunshot. And he said, America will rue the day the Soviet Union fell. Your first instinct is, he's out of his mind. We were preoccupied with, but if you think about it, the Soviets may have been menacing, but they weren't crazy. And compared to the next big event, 9/11, Soviet Union looked very compatible in contrast. Another takeaway, by 2000, after the 2000 election, Florida matters. I probably used this line a dozen times in the book. Florida matters. For most of American history, Florida was physically, politically, and culturally on the sidelines. In 1920, by the way, Florida's population of 1 million was the lowest in the American South. On the eve of Pearl Harbor, South Carolina and Arkansas had more people than Florida. Today, we're almost at 22 million. We've passed New York, the Empire State, as the third largest state in the nation. I mean, it's an extraordinary trajectory in our of America's three largest states, California, Texas, and Florida. Florida is the only one that is marginally has a healthy two-party system. Although, if you were born in 2001, you've never seen a Democratic governor in Florida. But technically, and until a few months ago, there were still more registered Democrats than Republicans. Of course, the most fascinating aspect of that is the rise of independence. 50 years earlier, you would have been insane to register as independent. Being a Democrat or Republican reflected your family, your county, your city's heritage. You were a Republican because of Lincoln and the Civil War, a Democrat because of the Civil War. But in the rise of independence, it's almost 1/3 of registered voters is extraordinary today. The decade 2000-2010, looking back at it, was the golden era of Tampa Bay politics. Adam Smith was there. And think about this. There was not a single gubernatorial election without a candidate from Tampa Bay. In 2002, Bill McBride had no real chance against the incumbent Jeb Bush. Bill McBride, looking back at, has there ever been a more talented individual living in this area? Phi Beta Kappa, University of Florida, starting football fullback for the Gators, begins law school, drops out to volunteer for Vietnam, Marines, and then a powerful lawyer in the area, Alex Sink, took the baton. In 2006, both candidates were from Tampa Bay. Charlie Crist, then a Republican, against Jim Davis. In fact, Jim Davis and Peter Rudy Wallace are in many ways a poster child of the Democratic Party, poster children of the Democratic Party. Both of them seemingly endless possibilities, but dropped out at the height of power because being a Democrat seemed irrelevant. Peter Rudy Wallace, by the way, is the answer to the trivia question, who was the last Democratic Speaker of the House? And by the way, anyone here know the last Democratic President of the Senate? Early 1990s, Gwen Margolis. See, I thought you were a savvy crowd. Wait a second. Moderation. Moderation used to be a virtue in American politics and American life. Not so much anymore. In many ways, the 2004 election, I think, was that dividing line between them. Was there ever a more interesting U.S. senatorial race than Mel Martinez versus Betty Castor? Betty Castor, president of USF. How many of you were here in 1974? It was either 1973 or 1974. You may remember the incident. Betty Castor, I believe, was a county commissioner, was having lunch at the university club at a meeting, and a waitress comes up and says, "Ma'am, women are not allowed at the university club unless you're a waitress." And she had to leave. And she said, "I decided either I'm going to get angry or I'm going to get even." And Calvin Trillin picked this story up and wrote an essay in New Yorker magazine about Tampa, the university club, and kind of misogyny at this time. A green background, taught in Africa, and is this me? Oh, hold on. I'm going to read a story here that I love. So at the end of the election, of course, Betty Castor could never pick the lock of Sammy Allarian. Sammy Allarian, anyone here not remember the Sammy Allarian story? I'm not sure we even know today whether he was more sinning or sinned against. People have very strong opinions about it. But regardless, that was the reason Betty Castor lost his very close election. Howard Troxler of the then St. Petersburg Times wrote, "Mel Martinez, really good guy, really sleazy campaigner." By the way, that's another aspect of this decade, the collapse of the newspaper industry. The story is, at the end of the campaign, at the end of the campaign, I said there was a moment, the best unscripted moment of 2006, by the way, was when Mel met Michael at the Orlando Executive Airport at the day of the election. Michael Moore runs into Mel Martinez. Michael Moore, kind of flamethrower at this time on the left, Mel Martinez, the candidate, and Moore says to Mel Martinez, "Mel, I know this has been an ugly campaign, but we're Americans, and let's shake on it." And Mel Martinez said, "You're right. You know, there's things more important than politics." What's the chances of that scene happening today, given this era of immoderation? The Great Recession. This decade, 2010, is a roller coaster. First 5-6 years, extraordinary boom. new communities, frantic growth. Florida is poised to overtake New York, and would by 2012. And new ways of living, places like Celebration. It's a really exciting decade in terms of growth. And then I have a chapter called On the Brink. And I interviewed a lot of newspaper business editors and asked them, what's the moment you realized Florida was in trouble? And one of them said, I was dating waitresses and school teachers in Sarasota, and they were all millionaires because they were flipping houses. Flipping became a very popular verb at this time. It seemed like cocktail parties revolved around the question, did you hear how much that house on Beach Drive sold? Just frantic growth, followed by the most searing economic downturn since the Great Depression. You have to put this in perspective. Florida really had not been in an economic downturn since the late 1920s. There had not been anything like this. I think I have 3 chapters on the Great Recession because of the many ideas and events that came out of this. An opioid crisis. How many of you had even heard of the word opioid or could spell it in 2005? This is really serious stuff. There was a moment, it was so serious, America's median age dropped because of so many people dying, young people dying. New ways of living. More and more women were living alone. How many of you haven't seen this? The big financial corporations decided we're going to double down on Florida. We're going to move in and buy inexpensive housing. And we're then going to rent it, but with new guidelines. You're responsible for the plumbing, for the maintenance. And then when the market peaks again, we're going to sell it. I mean, you see this everywhere, signs of rent, but you don't recognize the local company because it's an international company. The orange industry tanked. Well, I teach a class every summer in the honors program in Tampa. And the first day when the students come in, I ask them, and I'm going to ask you the question. Probably, let's see. How many of you began your day today with a glass of orange juice? One person. Now, I'm not a demographer or an ad man, but I think that tells you something. How many of you, when you were 12 years old, began your day with a glass of orange juice? Let me see. I don't think you really need a genius to connect the dots there. But the citrus industry is in trouble for 2 reasons. One is consumption. It's fattening. It's old-fashioned. But you've got so many alternatives. You can get kiwi-flavored soda water now. You can go to Starbucks and things like that. But the industry is also in trouble because of a new disease that began during this decade called citrus greening. Chinese greening absolutely wiped out groves. Don't feel too bad for the grove owners. Most of them have sold the land for future condos. An icon, I mean, Florida. The orange was almost an unofficial partner with Florida for most of its history. The newspaper industry. You think about this, if we were here in 2004, most of you would be carrying a copy of the Tampa Tribune, and then the St. Petersburg Times. It was the golden age of newspapers. They were making money. If you were selling the car, wanting to know what was on sale that week at Publix, you subscribe to a newspaper. You don't need me to tell you the newspaper industry is in serious trouble. If there's a pivotal figure in the book, it's Charlie Crist. Charlie Crist, his decision in 2010, so the little context here. 2010 governor's race, Charlie Crist is going to coast to victory as a Republican governor. He's, in spite of the Great Recession, he's doing very well in polls. Do I have a minute?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. He's doing very well on the polls. And then Mel Martinez, this is kind of the tripwire for everything. Mel Martinez decides, I don't like Washington. I miss my family. And actually this happened in 2008 in preparation for 2010 election. And he said, I want you to think about replacing me. I don't think I'm going to finish my term, which will be over in 2010. And then he comes back a few months later and said, I want to be replaced now. And Crist replaced him with, Adam, help me, his lieutenant governor from Fort Myers.
George Lemieux.
Who?
George Lemieux.
George Lemieux. Who Crist is pretty sure is not going to run again. And then, but when Mel Martinez decides he's going to leave office early, he points to Lemieux, and then Crist decides he's going to run for the U.S. Senate. And that is a pivotal moment. I honestly do not think if Crist had run for re-election, anyone here would know the name Rick Scott, unless you were in the hospital industry or the legal industry.
Or the prison system.
Or in the prison industry. And I'm not sure anyone would know Marco Rubio unless you were from Miami. Marco Rubio was a relatively minor figure in I think he was a senator by then, Florida senator, state senate. But the tripwire was sprung in Florida politics overnight. And Rick Scott wins his first race, and then also defeats Alex Nink later. There's also an event. I'll end it here. The event. How many of you have I said what's the most infamous hug in Florida history? Know what I'm talking about? A few of you. So Obama is elected president during the Great Recession, and he's giving a speech at the Fort Myers airport, and Crist, responsibly, by the way, realizes Florida is in bad shape. We need help from the federal government. So Crist is going to introduce him. He introduces him, and Obama comes up, and this is unscripted, gives him what Obama called a bro hug. And the cameras clicked, and within weeks of this, the Tea Party is organized, and Charlie Crist will become the first victim of the Tea Party in the primaries, and that caused Crist to switch parties, etc. Open for questions.